the title that we've given to the event, I don't recall exactly what it is. It's something like endless war, radical executive power, and what is it? A rotted political culture. Very subtle and understated as a title. A characteristic of both Professor Sheth, I think, and myself. And sure. And I think what is at the heart of that topic, all of those topics combined, the reason why they all fit under one rubric is the erosion of civil liberties in the United States, particularly, though not only, over the last 12 years in the name of the war on terror. And this is the topic that I tend to write a great deal about, the erosion of civil liberties, the war being waged on civil liberties. And there's lots of different ways to talk about that issue or to write about it. But I think the most productive thing to do at the outset whenever we think about that issue is to ask what that term even means, what the term civil liberties even signifies. And the reason I think that's a profitable thing to do is because there's this odd paradox in our political discourse that typically the most invoked phrases are often the most ill-defined. Terrorism is probably the leading example of what I mean by that, a word that is continuously invoked to justify a wide array of policies and beliefs, and yet you can find almost nobody who has a coherent, consistently applied definition of what that term even means. I think civil liberties is a somewhat more nuanced example, but one that is illustrative of the same dynamic, because civil liberties has almost taken on this sort of hackneyed, empty cliche status. People throw that term around all the time. It's not really a term that gets debated. You never see a political leader or a media figure stand up and say, okay, I'm here because I just want you to know that I'm opposed to civil liberties, right? Nobody ever says that. It's just a term that gets, like a flag that gets waved to justify a wide array of views. And so I think it's worth spending a little bit of time asking what it is that that term means when we use it. And the good thing about asking that question, what is it that we mean when we use the phrase civil liberties, is that the term is actually fairly simple and straightforward. All we really mean when we talk about civil liberties is it is the list of limitations that we have imposed on the government in terms of the power that they exercise and what it is that they can do to us. That's all we really mean when we talk about civil liberties, is the limitations imposed on the government. And these limitations, the crucial aspect of these limitations is that adherence to these limitations, refusing to cross the lines that we've said you cannot cross in how you exercise your power, is a precondition to our accepting the assertion of power by the state as legitimate and valid. We recognize state power as valid and legitimate only if this list of limitations is adhered to, the ones that we've imposed. And what's particularly good about asking this question about the list of limitations that we've imposed on state power is we don't actually have to go searching for this list. They're all conveniently assembled in one place called the Bill of Rights or the Constitution. And the other good thing about this list of limitations that we've imposed on the state is that they are not ambiguous, nor are they conditional or circumstantial. By which I mean that the limitations that we've imposed on the state, the rights that we have not to have the state cross those lines, this list of limitations is not waivable in certain situations. It's not dilutable when applied to some groups as opposed to other groups. They are rights that exist in all circumstances and are rights that can be legitimately claimed by all groups and all people. They're really absolute in their nature. And to know that that's true, to know that these rights are absolute in their nature, that this list of limitations is absolute, all you need to do is look at what those rights are, what these limitations on state power are, and see what they say. So if you look at the First Amendment, it says, Congress shall make no law abridging freedom of speech. The Fourth Amendment says there shall be no search warrant issued except upon a finding of probable cause. The Fifth Amendment says no person shall be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. They are absolute intrinsically in the way that they've been constructed. A few years ago, I think in 2008 or 2009, I had this very acrimonious exchange with Joe Klein of Time magazine. And I've actually had very many acrimonious exchanges with Joe Klein at Time Magazine. This one in particular that I'm thinking about was some sort of disagreement that arose over some kind of a civil liberties issue. I forget exactly what the specifics were, but it was a fairly endured disagreement that took place over the course of, I think, 2.5 or 3 weeks in our respective columns, and it became increasingly acrimonious, and we were hurling all sorts of insults at one another. And sort of halfway through, he wrote a column replying to something I had written, and he said at the top, he said, you know, I think that the important thing to realize, what's really driving this disagreement, is that Glenn Greenwald is a civil liberties extremist. And I honestly, I remember reading that, and I was genuinely confused and kind of bewildered because I thought, we're having this really vituperative exchange where we're hurling insults at one another. Why did he just suddenly decide to stop in the middle and lavish me with this incredible praise? Oh, I'm a civil liberty. I thought it was very nice of him that he was extending an olive branch. And then I realized, no, actually, he meant that as an insult. To him, being a civil liberties extremist is a bad thing. And the reason that confused me and bewildered me at first is because I think civil liberties extremist is probably the greatest compliment I can be paid. I kind of fantasize about my tombstone saying, "Here lies Glenn Greenwald, civil liberties extremist." And the reason for that is because if you look at what these rights are, if you look at what these limitations are, there is no way to believe in them or defend them or advocate them without being an extremist about it. Once you start saying you think it's permissible for the government to cross these lines in certain circumstances, or that it's okay for them to violate these rights when it's applied to those groups of people over there, once you start making exceptions to that extremism, by definition, those rights no longer exist. By definition, those guarantees are illusory and you no longer believe in them. And I think when we talk about the state of civil liberties in the United States, or to use the title of the talk, radical executive power, I think all you need to do is to look at that list that I just referenced of the limitations we've imposed on state power and ask what the status of them is. So if you look at the First Amendment, for example, what you find over the last 12 years in the United States are dozens and dozens and dozens of cases of the US government prosecuting Muslims, usually young American Muslims, for the crime of material support for terrorism that is based almost exclusively on opinions they've expressed about the US government and not acts that they've engaged in, the ultimate violation of the First Amendment's guarantee against freedom of speech being abridged. If you look at the massive surveillance state that the United States government has erected in the wake of the 9/11 era that literally tracks and monitors virtually every communication that American citizens have with one another without any need to show any kind of evidence that the person is suspected of a crime, let alone probable cause to believe they've committed a crime, it's an extreme repudiation of the Fourth Amendment guarantee against probable cause, against search warrants being issued in the absence of probable cause. And if you look at the power that the current president has claimed, the power to target even American citizens in secret without charging them with any crime for execution, a power that he's not only claimed in theory but exercised in practice, that is the most extreme and egregious violation of the Fifth Amendment's promise that no person shall have their life deprived without due process of law. And so when I look at the state of civil liberties in the United States, what I see are not isolated or episodic violations. What I see are fundamental and really systematic repudiations of the framework that was supposed to protect us from transgression on the part of the state in the assertion of its power. And I just want to spend a little time before Professor Sheth and I have our discussion, then we have some Q&A, asking two questions about that fact, about the fact that there's been this fundamental and systemic renunciation of this framework. The first question is, why has that been allowed to happen? Why have we allowed the government to cross all of these lines that was never supposed to cross with very little resistance and for as long a period of time as we've allowed it to do that? And the second question I think is worth asking is, what are the implications from having a government, a state, that can exercise power without constraint, without any real form of limitation? So let me just address that first question somewhat briefly, which is, why have we allowed these rights to be violated, this list of limitations to be so cavalierly and continuously disregarded? And I think there's several factors that explain why it is that we've allowed that, why it is that we've permitted this to endure. The first of which is that all of this has taken place in the framework of endless war. The United States is a country, just think about this, that really is true, that the United States is a country that for 12 straight years now has run around the world proclaiming proudly, beating its chest and proclaiming, we are a nation at war. That we are a nation at war is an orthodoxy that every political figure is required to affirm upon pain of being expelled from the halls of seriousness. Most people can't identify with whom we are at war exactly or where we are at war, but nonetheless, the concept that we are at war is one that everybody in political life is required to embrace. And the reason that's so significant in terms of allowing the government to exercise power without limitation is because it is always the case that wartime is when political leaders can exert power without any limitations of any kind. This has been true forever. 2,000 years ago, Cicero said, when men take up arms, the law falls mute. In war, there are no legal limits on the ability of a political leader to do whatever he wants. He can surveil, he can detain, he can kill on a battlefield, and he can do it all in secret. And we are a country that has now had 2 successive administrations that have said we are not only at war, but we are at war on a battlefield that has no finite physical limits. The entire globe is a battlefield, including U.S. soil. And so when you posit that the United States is a nation at war for this long a period of time, and the war extends without any physical limits, what you're essentially saying is that we have a government that can assert the power on a battlefield, which is unlimited, anywhere in the world. And I think this is a really crucial thing about a country continuously affirming that it's at war. Oftentimes, the reason why war is horrific is because it creates lots of carnage and death of innocent people, and that gets a fair amount of attention. But war is also horrific, at least equally as importantly, because of the way in which it transforms and degrades the political institutions and the political culture of the country that is prosecuting it. And so the fact that we have run around telling ourselves that we are a country at war is a major reason why so much of this has been acquiesced to and justified, and why it's been so difficult to place limits on it. A second reason why we've allowed this to endure is because of the perception that has been deliberately cultivated that the abuse of power, the violation of rights, is affecting only one particular marginalized minority group, in particular Muslims. And this is the tactic that every single government in every single country in every single period of time uses when it wants to seize additional power. In the first instance, it targets a minority group within the society that it expects and knows is so disliked or feared or marginalized that the rest of the population will either be apathetic about what is being done to that group or overtly supportive. And there's lots of reasons why that mentality is so misguided. The first is the obvious, just grotesque morality of accepting the premise that I'm only going to care about injustices if they directly threaten and affect me, and if they don't, I'm going to overlook or sanction them. But even for pragmatic reasons, even if you can't convince somebody to shed that grotesque morality, for pragmatic reasons, it's incredibly misguided, because it is always the case, not sometimes the case, not usually the case, always the case, that abuses of state power extend far beyond the group to which they're originally applied. So that if you acquiesce to rights violations because you think it's being done only to one group that doesn't affect you, or to one group that probably deserves it, what you're doing is you're legitimizing and institutionalizing that rights abuse, so that when it starts to expand to other groups, maybe groups that you think don't deserve it, or groups that include you, you lose the ability to object because you've cheered for it in that first instance and therefore institutionalized it. And you see this in all sorts of ways with the war on terror. If you look at the Patriot Act, which was justified in the name of terrorism, if you look at the statistics of when those detention and surveillance powers have been invoked, overwhelmingly it's in cases having nothing to do with Islamic radicalism or terrorism. It's been applied in all sorts of cases completely unrelated to those crimes. And if you look at the last several years of civil rights controversies, what you see is the gradual importation of war on terror tactics onto domestic soil, So we now have laws that have codified the power of indefinite detention, putting people in cages without charges. Once the hallmark of Guantanamo, there are now laws that codify that and permit its use on American soil when applied to U.S. citizens. You see the paramilitarization of local, state, and federal police forces using tactics pioneered in Baghdad. You see a huge fleet of drones that are being approved, that have already been approved for use by local and federal police departments in the United States. All of these abuses and radical acts that have been acquiesced to because of the perception that it was being applied only on foreign soil, largely to Muslims, has now been increasingly applied to Americans on U.S. soil. That's because these abuses always expand beyond their original application. But the perception that it's been applied only to Muslims is a major reason why it's been permitted to endure. And then the final reason that is worth thinking about in terms of why this has been permitted for so long without much resistance is the role that partisan allegiance plays in how people respond to these questions. And I'll just give you a couple of examples. There's this extraordinary 2008 report that was prepared by the CIA and marked top secret that, thanks to its being leaked to WikiLeaks, you can now go online and read, and I encourage you to do so. And this 2008 CIA report was written in the middle of the presidential election when President Obama, then Senator Obama, was running against John McCain. And the concern that prompted this CIA report was that there was spreading anti-war sentiment in Western Europe. There were all kinds of populations within Western Europe that were growing increasingly opposed to the war in Afghanistan, and several Western European governments had fallen, prime ministers had been removed because of their participation in that war. And the CIA was petrified that this anti-war sentiment would continue to spread, would either bring down more governments supportive of the war in Afghanistan or compel supportive governments to withdraw and leave the burden resting exclusively on the United States. And they were even concerned that this anti-war sentiment, if it weren't contained, would seep into the United States and start to infect the populace in the United States as well. And what this report concluded explicitly, you can just go read it, is that the best weapon that the CIA had to arrest this trend of anti-war sentiment, the best antidote to what the CIA viewed as the sickness, that people were thinking that war was bad, the best way to stop it would be if the United States elected Barack Obama as president. And their rationale for it was that once President Obama became the face of these wars, rather than George Bush's face, which had alienated the entire world, that people who were otherwise be inclined to oppose the war would, as a result of their affection for him personally, begin to view the war much more positively. Once it became his wars, huge numbers of people who previously were opposed would suddenly view the war in a much different light, and this anti-war sentiment in Western Europe, where he was popular, and in the United States, would be arrested. And usually the CIA gets pretty much everything wrong, but in this case it was incredibly prescient. It really was. I mean, what they described happening is exactly what ended up happening to the anti-war movement globally and in the United States, which is that it basically disappeared upon the election of President Obama. Once it became his wars, people who were affectionate toward him or his party became much less inclined to oppose those wars. And it wasn't just U.S. militarism where this dynamic asserted itself, but also in terms of civil liberties erosions as well. And I know this from my own personal experience. I've been talking about these civil liberties issues and these policies for 8 years now or so, going around the country, writing about them, talking about them. And 5 years ago or 6 years ago, when George Bush was president, if I were to go into a room like this and randomly assemble 500 citizens and stand up and denounce all the policies that I've just denounced, you would have roughly half the room incredibly hostile and antagonistic to what I was saying. Those people were called Republicans. And the other 50% of the room would be boisterously supportive. They would clap and they would cheer and they would say I was defending American values and the shredding of the Constitution from this radical president. And those people were called Democrats because they opposed all these civil liberties abuses. 4 years later or 5 years later, if you were to assemble the same room of people and I were to stand up and make the same exact arguments and denounce the same exact policies, 80% of the room would hate me. And maybe 20% would be supportive, because the way in which these policies have now become no longer the policies of just the Republican Party, but have become bipartisan consensus, have transformed the views of huge numbers of citizens from opposing these policies vehemently, or at least pretending to being apathetic towards them or even overtly supportive of them, because the leader they like and the party they support is the one who is now perpetuating it. And I think the real lesson of that is that the way that constitutional rights and just political liberties in general are safeguarded is not by going to the ballot box once every 4 years and electing a political leader who we like and trust. The way that rights are guaranteed is by citizens banding together and demanding that no matter who wields power, that those limitations be observed. And this idea that we don't place trust in political leaders to safeguard our rights, that we demand adherence to those rights regardless, has been embedded in the ethos of the American founding. Thomas Jefferson said, "In questions of power, let no more be heard about confidence in man, but bind him down for mischief with the chains of the Constitution." And the great abolitionist Frederick Douglass said, and I think this is an even more astute quote, he said, "Find out what people will quietly submit to. Find out what they will quietly submit to, and you have the exact measure of the injustice and wrongs that will be imposed on them." It's really an observation about human nature that whatever abuses of power you let political leaders engage in because you like them, you trust them, you're happy with it, you trust them to do it in the right way, whatever abuses of power you submit to for whatever reasons, any human being by virtue of human nature will seize on that and will abuse that power exactly to the extent that you permit them to do so. But the way in which partisan allegiance plays such a critical role in shaping people's reactions to these kind of issues is a truly significant reason why this has been permitted to endure for as long as it has. So I just want to spend the remainder of my time asking that second question, which is, and to me this is the most important question, what are the implications for having a government that has pursued these policies, that has disregarded these limitations for over a decade now and with no end in sight? And there are lots of implications, some obvious ones. If you allow the government to punish people because of their speech and put them in prison for decades because of it, or to spy on us and eliminate privacy, or to kill us without charges, those are inherent injustices that don't need explanation. They're self-evident. But there are other implications that are somewhat elusive and difficult to apprehend, but that I think are even more consequential. And I want to highlight two in particular. One of them, one implication from allowing the government to do these things for as long as we have, is that radicalism and extremism become normalized very quickly. And I just want to share an anecdote, a personal anecdote, that really underscored for me just how viscerally true that was. That really has kind of shaped the way I think about that issue. Last year, I was speaking at a university in Indiana, Purdue University, and 3 high school sophomores drove up several hours to hear me speak, and they were high school journalists. They worked on their school newspaper, and they said they wanted to interview me after the speech and write up an article for their school newspaper. And I said, okay, and I sat down and talked to them after I spoke, and what I ended up saying to them was so much less interesting, for me at least, than what they ended up saying to me. What one of them said to me, and I talked about civil liberties and the change that took place in the wake of 9/11. She was a 10th grade girl, and she said to me, look, you always write about the changes that have taken place and the radical transformation of American political culture in the wake of 9/11, but what you should understand is that for people my age, she said, I'm 15, I was 4 at the time of the 9/11 attack. There really is no such thing as the pre-9/11 world and the post-9/11 world. The post-9/11 world is all that people of that age are aware of and know. That what has happened in the post-9/11 age is the totality of their political consciousness. And that's true for people even somewhat older, 18, 19, 20, 21. There really is no political consciousness grounded in the preservation of these rights that existed prior to 9/11. The radicalism and the extremism of the post-9/11 age has become normalized for a huge portion of the population. And every year that goes by and it endures, it becomes more and more normalized and therefore more difficult to combat. And I think a really interesting example that proves just how true that is is the enactment of the Patriot Act in the wake of the 9/11 attacks in 2001. When the Patriot Act was enacted, it was actually quite controversial, even in the wake of the 9/11 attack, when citizens were pretty much willing to acquiesce to anything the government wanted. There were all kinds of vociferous debates on the editorial pages of newspapers, in the halls of Congress, because there was a recognition that this was an extreme and radical departure from the way in which the United States government had previously conducted itself. And in fact, it was so recognized as being extreme that even the US Congress in 2001 put a provision in the Patriot Act that said the detention and surveillance powers that we are authorizing shall expire in 4 years. Because the idea was we don't want these radical powers that we feel we need to vest in the government to become permanent. And what happened in 4 years, in 2005, under a Republican president and a Republican Congress, was the Patriot Act got renewed overwhelmingly, almost with no debate, by a vote of 91-8 in the Senate. And then again, 5 years later, in 2010, with a Democratic president and a Democratic Congress, it got renewed again by an even wider margin of 93-4. Without a single reform. Nobody even talks about the Patriot Act anymore. Nobody even thinks about it as being a symbol of radicalism. It's become completely normalized. It's just embedded into our political framework, and we all accept that those powers that just 10 years ago were considered so extreme we had to cap them is now something that we're going to live with permanently. That is the way in which extremism becomes normalized. The citizenry gets trained to accept it and to no longer even view it as something to resist. And that is a very profound implication every year that goes by, that these extreme policies become viewed that way. The last implication that I just want to highlight is, to me, probably the most important one of everything that we're discussing here tonight. And it's a very kind of ethereal concept and a little bit difficult to get at, but I think it is by far the most consequential issue, at least that I write about, in terms of how I perceive them. And that is this. When you have a government that is allowed to cross whatever lines it wants in terms of how it asserts power without any accountability or consequence, that fundamentally changes the relationship between the citizenry and the government. It radically transforms the kind of political culture that we have. And what I mean by that is this. In a free society, by definition, people who wield power have fear of what will happen if they abuse their power. They have fear of the people over whom that power is exercised. They fear that if they abuse power, they will have political ramifications. Maybe they'll be removed from office. They fear reputational damage, that they will be living in disgrace and shame. They fear legal ramifications, perhaps, that they will be investigated, indicted, and prosecuted. And they may even fear physical consequences, that they will be attacked and killed. Those are healthy fears that you want people asserting power to feel. You want them to fear the abuse of power. That's what happens in a free society by definition. In a tyrannical society, by definition, the exact opposite dynamic prevails. The people over whom power is exercised, citizens, end up in fear of those who wield power. And those who wield power exercise that power without any fear of any kind. Because citizens know that there are no limitations on what the government can do to them, and therefore they fear people who wield power, either in government or the factions that government serves. And I just want to share, to close up, another personal anecdote that was probably the single most profound and influential episode that I've had in my time of writing about and advocating on political issues that has really shaped how I view what I just talked about in a very kind of primal way. I've written a lot about the organization WikiLeaks over the last 3 years, almost always defending the transparency that they're bringing to the national security state and to the intelligence community of the United States. And the very first time that I wrote about WikiLeaks was in January of 2010. And January 2010 was a time when almost nobody had heard of WikiLeaks, including me. It was before they had released any of their news-making disclosures, before they released the video of showing the helicopter in Baghdad shooting reporters and then the people who came to rescue them, before they really released anything that made news in the United States. And the way that I had come to learn about WikiLeaks in January of 2010 was that the Pentagon in 2008 had prepared a top-secret report. And this top-secret report explicitly decreed WikiLeaks to be an enemy of the state. It said WikiLeaks poses severe national security threats to the United States. And the report plotted ways that the Pentagon wanted to destroy WikiLeaks and prevent it from operating effectively. And ironically enough, this top secret report got leaked to WikiLeaks, which then published it on their website. And somehow the New York Times had discovered this report, and the New York Times wrote a very short article about this report, talking about this obscure Australian hacker who created this weird transparency group, which for some reason the Pentagon has decided is a profound enemy of the state and wants to destroy. And I stumbled across this New York Times article by accident. And I remember when I read the article thinking, you know, I don't know anything about WikiLeaks, I've never heard of them, but any group that the Pentagon has declared to be an enemy of the state and wants to destroy is one that definitely merits a lot more attention and probably a lot of support. And so I went and I researched WikiLeaks, and I saw some extraordinarily valuable acts of transparency they brought to places like municipalities in Australia, to lying by corporations about toxic waste dumping in East Africa, to state officials in Germany who had lied about a fire. And I really understood and saw the value and promise that the model of transparency they were creating held. And so I wrote a long article praising this model, enthusiastically hailing the promise that it held. I interviewed Julian Assange. I posted the audio of the interview, and at the end of the article, I encouraged my readers to financially donate to WikiLeaks, because I knew that they were sitting on all kinds of important leaks that they ended up disclosing, but they had financial constraints that prevented them from processing those. So I encouraged them to donate, and I posted the links about how they could do that electronically, by wiring money, by donating by PayPal, and other ways. And in response to my writing that article, I had dozens and dozens and dozens of people, literally, in all kinds of venues, like in events like this, by email, in the comment section to my article, say to me something along the lines of, look, I completely understand what you've written about WikiLeaks. I understand your enthusiasm for them. I support what they're doing as well. I want to support them. My only concern is that if I do what you recommend and I donate money to WikiLeaks electronically, I have a fear that I'm going to end up on a government list somewhere, or that I can even be subjected to criminal liability if WikiLeaks is declared to be a terrorist organization and I'm then charged with materially supporting a terrorist group. And these were not, you know, like crazy people prone to conspiracy theories and paranoia. Trust me, I recognize those people instantly because of extensive interaction with them. These were really sober, rational people. And the reason it had such a profound effect on me was because these were American citizens who had voluntarily relinquished, out of fear, their own core constitutional liberties, which is what donating money to a political organization whose cause you support is. It's pure free speech and free association. They had relinquished their own rights because of fear of what their government would do to them, even though they're guaranteed the right to exercise those political liberties without being punished for them. And what that made me realize is that you can offer all the pretty political rights and liberties you want on a piece of paper or a piece of parchment, but if you successfully intimidate and threaten and bully the citizenry out of exercising those rights, they become completely worthless, completely illusory. And I had that same experience when I wrote for the first time about the U.S. government's treatment of Bradley Manning, the then 22-year-old Army private who just this week admitted to being the whistleblower who furnished most of those documents to WikiLeaks. And as most of you probably recall, there was a controversy in December 2010. I wrote about it for the first time then, and it became a very big controversy that the U.S. government was detaining Manning before he was convicted of anything in extremely oppressive conditions, prolonged solitary confinement, forcing him to stand naked, forcing him into all sorts of humiliating postures, just abusing him. The UN ultimately investigated and found that he was subjected to cruel and inhuman treatment. And I remember the first time I wrote about it, lots of people asked me, and I even asked myself, why would the US government subject Manning to this kind of a treatment? It just seems counterproductive from a rational perspective. It turns Manning into a martyr. It shifts the controversy from what he did to what the US government did, and in fact, Obama's own State Department spokesman publicly denounced the treatment and then ultimately resigned over it. It jeopardizes their ability to prosecute him because it renders statements that he makes in captivity subject to exclusion on the grounds that they're the byproduct of coercion. It just didn't make any sense why the government, just in their own self-interest, would want to do this. And then I thought about it a little bit, and what I realized was that the reason that the U.S. government did that to Bradley Manning is the same reason that the U.S. government threatens to prosecute WikiLeaks and punish its supporters, even though they have every legal right to do what they're doing. It's the same reason that the U.S. government spent 10 plus years abducting and kidnapping people from around the world and shipping them off to a prison island in the middle of the Caribbean Sea and dressing them in orange jumpsuits and shackles and taking pictures of them and showing the world. It's because the U.S. government deliberately wants to send the signal that there are no limitations that we adhere to in the power that we can assert. If you think about challenging us, if you think about blowing the whistle on what we've done in secret, look at what we've done to Bradley Manning. If you think about exposing the bad acts we're doing, look at what we've done to WikiLeaks. If you think about meaningfully challenging our foreign policy, look at the people rotting in Guantanamo for as long as we want to keep them there, or the people that we target for death without any accountability or due process. They want this climate of fear to be maintained because it's that climate of fear that engenders passivity and submission and obedience, all grounded in fear that any meaningful dissent will result in serious punishment because the government no longer needs to honor or abide by the list of limitations that I began by talking about that we've imposed on their power. And that really is the primary implication of the way in which this system, this dynamic, radically alters our political culture. So the last thing I just want to say in just a couple minutes, and I'm sure we'll talk about this more, it's the question of what can be done about all of this. And the reason I like to end with that, even if it's just for a couple minutes, is because if you don't talk about what can be done all of this, you can it's very easy to spread this like really ugly, dark, gloomy defeatism. Like, God, I just listened to this guy talk for an hour about all the hideous things taking place. I think I want to just go into my room and shut the door and hide under my bed or throw myself off a bridge or something. And the reason why that is such a misguided reaction, tempting though it might be, is because there's really one clear lesson from every component of history: American history, foreign history, very, very distant history, recent history. And that lesson is that any institutions that are constructed by human beings, no matter how formidable or invulnerable they seem, can always be modified or torn down and replaced by other human beings if the right passion and strategy and commitment are summoned. And there's the Arab Spring, in which the most deprived populations in the world subverted the most entrenched dictators. There's all sorts of examples in American history, as critical as we are and should be about it, of the most marginalized and oppressed groups not waiting around for their rights, but banding together to demand and claim them, and therefore obtaining them, that prove this to be true, that prove how ill-advised defeatism is. And I think that lesson of history always should be the overarching one in any discussion like this. So the question isn't, why are things so bad? The question really is, what is it that we can do about them now that we understand them? So with that, I thank you very much for listening, and we will have our discussion.
I have like pages and pages and pages of questions. But I guess, one of the questions that's coming up immediately, just because of the context in which we are, where we are, we're at a college, and with many students, undergrads who are maybe 12, right, or even younger when 9/11 happened. So probably 10 or something like that. So, and you mentioned this, that there is a kind of normalization to this. So what does it mean to kind of resist that normalization and say, look, this is not okay, you're accustomed to living under surveillance, you're accustomed to, being frisked at the airport and to have these kinds of paramilitary practices. How do you, because in a sense, I think it's not, obviously most of the undergrads who are here are clearly aware that this is a problem, but I also think that there is some sense that the normalization reduces the level of fear among a large part of the population that would not attend your talks or would not be here, right?
Right. So, that's a big part of the challenge, is to figure out how it is that these things can be resisted given a population that either is convinced or convincing themselves, that they're not particularly constrained by these policies, and oftentimes that's just a psychological tactic. If you tell yourself that you're free, but you really aren't, often it's a way of just relieving yourself of the obligation to confront things that you'd rather not confront. None of us like to think of ourselves as oppressed. We all like to think of ourselves as free. But ultimately, I'd say two things. One is that most of these conceptions of liberty and freedom and the right to be free of abusive state power aren't really things that have to be taught or learned. They're really intrinsic to just what human nature is. And I'll give you a perfect example. There's this theory that in the age of the internet and the sort of Silicon Valley has propagated this perspective that privacy is dead, that it's sort of an obsolete relic, that we don't need it, we don't value it, we don't cherish it. And a lot of times you'll have people who resist the idea that privacy matters, and they'll think, well, if I'm not doing anything criminal, why do I care if the government knows what I'm doing, or I don't have anything to hide, so I don't really care, or privacy is this obsolete relic. And you can see in their own behavior that they actually don't really believe that, right? They have locks on their bedroom door inside their home to prevent people from coming in and seeing what they're doing. They have locks on their bathroom. They have passwords on their email accounts that if you ask them to provide you, they are unlikely to give those to you. If you propose that you be permitted to put cameras in every room of wherever it is they're living, they're likely to reject that proposal. And all of this behavior, these reactions, signify that they actually value privacy a great deal, because we know that there's a big difference between what we can do when we're being watched and what we can do when we're in private. That privacy is the realm where creativity exists, where we can explore, where we can challenge convention and orthodoxy, and where we can dissent. And so I think that these values, that the government shouldn't be able to kill you without charging you with a crime or being able to put you in a cage without proving you're guilty, are ones that even though people who are born into a political culture end up thinking as normal, are ones that are really anathema to the way that we think about ourselves and just what human nature desires. And that's the reason why you see in Arab cultures people who have never experienced these freedoms congregating in the streets, risking their lives to demand it. And so I think there's lots of evidence that people crave it, and then it's up to the people who understand these values and believe in them to figure out, using the power of ideas and reason, how to persuade other people to be equally committed.
Okay, so I'm going to harass you a little bit.
Good,
right?
That's what I'm here for.
So that makes sense at a certain level. And then what I think is, look, there are these kind of standard concerns about privacy. Philosophers, and by the way, here's what a philosophy degree could get you. I just want to make a pitch for philosophy. Glenn was an undergrad philosopher. But there's a way in which that doesn't translate into some of the most extreme practices that people accept at this point, as they're directed, for example, towards people in cages, right? So the enemy combatants who are in Guantanamo, or the other extreme example, which is Bradley Manning, Julian Assange, that those actually feel like they're fundamentally different from the kinds of fears that ordinary Americans, if you will, have, right? So that it's actually quite possible to say, yeah, I mean, I like my privacy, and that's great, but what does that have to do with anything else?
Right.
Right?
So, I think it's really important to recognize, and I think this is actually a problem and a failing on the part of, for want of a better word, sort of progressive movement in American history, civil liberties, advocacy, and the like. I think it's critically important to recognize just how potent and primal the forces are that get people to support these policies. Fear is an incredibly potent motivating force in our lives. And I know, like, when I talk about privacy, I have to stand up in a room like this and say, let me explain to you why privacy is important. People who want to scare people into being afraid of airplanes blowing up never need to stand up in a room and say, let me explain to you why it would be a bad thing if the airplane that you're on blows up. Like, people understand that already intuitively. It's fear. It's a very primal instinct. And so in order to combat that, it isn't enough to intellectualize these issues and to say, here are theories about why the fear is exaggerated or why these rights are important. It's critically important to compete with those primal fears. So if somebody is being driven by fear of criminals, which is what lets people support the massive American penal state, or terrorism, which is what lets them support all these policies we're discussing tonight, it's critically important to find some competing and equally potent primal drive. Whether it's appeal to their liberty and ability to be free, or whether it's an equal fear of what the government can do, what people in power can do, if these rights are allowed to be abridged. And I always think that has to be the tactic, not to mock or dismiss the idea that fear is a motivating factor, but to accept it and then figure out how to exploit it to direct it in more constructive ends.
But I think that that's actually, I mean, I would say that there's another side of that, which is to say that, you know, when people kind of, when again, I'm going to come back to Guantanamo, they're going to say that could never be me, right? That there is a way in which they're right. In fact, it probably won't be them if they're not Arab, if they're not Muslim, if they're not, right, caught from certain parts of the world. And so there is a way in which, you know, it can be explained, and I won't say justified, because you and I might tend to agree with that, right? But there's a way in which others who would disagree would say, no, actually, there's a really good reason why those folks are, and we've seen this on Twitter, right? We've seen this in your comments, we've all gotten this. Well, but these folks are terrorists, and so we understand why they need to be put in cages. That's not gonna happen to me, or an abstract me, right?
You know, first of all, I think there's always going to be a segment of the population that just can't be reached. And in order to build an effective political coalition, you don't have to reach every single person. You can write people off. You don't need any unanimity. And you know, I think sometimes you can kind of paralyze yourself with frustration when you think about, you know, your aunt who sits in front of Fox News all day and you're never going to get through to her, and you're like, God, this is just a losing proposition. I'm never going to get through to her, therefore I'm not going to get through to anybody else. And you're right that a big part of it is that certain people who are in certain situations because of their race or socioeconomic privilege and the like are more immunized from these concerns than other people are. But I would say a couple things. You know, one is, as I said earlier, this idea that, well, I'm not actually affected because I'm not Muslim, or I'm not, you know, living in an African American neighborhood where the police abuse their rights and where people just send you to prison at the bat of an eye, and therefore I don't have to care about these things. Again, I mean, I think lots of people can be persuaded to care about injustices even if they're not affected by them or likely to be affected by them. There are lots of people who spend their lives working on defending the rights of people at Guantanamo. There's a gentleman here who's a lawyer, and he represents for 9 years. And where are you?
Bill Newman, where are you?
No, Buzz Eisner.
Oh, Buzz
yeah,
Eisner.
And
there he is.
Okay, so,
yeah.
You know, if you look at him, he looks like, you know, just the kind of person in America, you know, a sort of white, educated person who's the last person who's going to end up at Guantanamo, and yet he's spending his time for not very much remuneration, if any, defending the rights of people at Guantanamo. And there's all kinds of examples in U.S. history where marginalized groups have attracted other people who aren't affected by that injustice, because people are not all selfish. You can appeal to the good attributes of people, but I also think you can convince people that even if they think they're immunized, they're actually not. And that's what I said earlier. If you look, for example, there's this FBI tactic that the FBI loves to use to end up being able to charge Muslims, whatever Muslims they want, with crimes, which is they find somebody who they think is hostile to the United States, and then what the FBI does is they go and they create a terrorist plot. Literally, they'll sit in the FBI and they're like, which bridge should we blow up, or, you know, like, which subway car should we target? And they then plot the terrorist attack, and they then provide the funding for it, and provide the resources for it, and then they go about recruiting the people who are going to do this actual plot, and they do that by targeting vulnerable, usually young Muslims, and manipulate them using their knowledge of psychology and other things to join the plot. And then at the last minute, the FBI heroically jumps in and disrupts their own plot and saves the day and keeps us all safe. And there are tons and tons of Muslims who are currently in prison for many decades because they've been coerced into those kind of plots. Increasingly, that tactic is now being used to infiltrate the Occupy movement. It has been used to entrap people protesting NATO policies. It has been used to target the anarchist movement. These are not largely Muslims. These are not largely people who are Arab. These are white Americans for the most part. And what you see is the proliferation of these abuses. And I think that anyone with a passing knowledge of American history knows that although, as I said when I was speaking, that originally in the first instance, marginalized groups will be targeted, that the danger is very real that they can be swept up. So when you combine sort of the goodwill of people, the willingness to work against injustices, even if it's not directly affecting you, with the ability to convince people that even if they think they're protected, they're actually not, I think you can build an effective coalition that's designed and that will ultimately result in providing meaningful resistance to these policies.
Okay, so I want to change tacks a little bit. You mentioned briefly, you talked about Julian Assange, who, as we know, has been, right, in effect, house arrest, right, or has taken refuge in the Ecuadorian embassy for what, over, how, I don't even know.
Combined with, I think, house arrest and now the embassy's probably been there for 2.5 years.
2.5 years or something like that.
And the microphone, please.
Sure. And so, one of the big debates over his seeking refuge and asking for political asylum has been, look, if in fact I'm extradited, there's a good chance that the UK will hand me over to the US where I will suffer a similar treatment to Bradley Manning. And then others basically, right, I mean, one of the things that he's been seeking refuge from as well has been rape charges in Sweden. Can you talk about that? What do you think? I mean, do you think that that's a legitimate, I mean, obviously you do, but...
Well, I mean, I'll just tell you a little story that kind of shapes my perspective on that. About 3 years ago, I guess, I met with somebody who was really instrumental in the early stages of WikiLeaks. He worked on the video of the Apache helicopter shooting the unarmed civilians in Baghdad. And he's a Dutch citizen, and he had stopped working on WikiLeaks by the time I met him. And he said that the reason that he stopped working on WikiLeaks is because he has 2 children, and he said he wasn't at all worried that the Dutch government, his own government, was going to charge him with the crime, because he thought if they did, he would get a lawyer, there's a healthy court system, he knew he did nothing wrong, he would be more than willing to take that risk and defend it, because he knew that he was willing to take that risk. He said what ultimately was the fear that drove him to stop working on WikiLeaks was the fear that his own government was going to knock on his door and not say, you've been charged with a crime, or taking you to a Dutch prison and then trying you in a Dutch court, but that we're knocking on your door because the United States has requested your extradition and we're handing you over to the United States. And this is a fear that I hear over and over from all kinds of people engaged in dissent. Their real fear is ending up in the grasp of the American justice system, because they see what happens to people over the last decade who are accused of being national security threats, particularly foreign nationals. They can be disappeared, they can be put into cages without any trials. If they are given trials, they're travesties of justice where conviction is virtually guaranteed. And the fact that people around the world are now petrified of ending up in the criminal justice system of the country that for 5 decades has proclaimed itself the leader of the free world and has continuously lectured everybody else on what a healthy criminal justice system entails is pretty remarkable. That fear is very real and it's very reasonable. And so if I were Julian Assange, I would be very scared of going to Sweden, a small country prone to U.S. pressure with a history of actually handing over suspects that the United States wanted.
Right?
Yeah, and at the same time, the charges that he faces in Sweden are very serious and deserve a resolution. And that's why he has always said, I will go on a plane to Stockholm tomorrow and face those charges if the Swedish government guarantees that my going there won't be then used to hand me over to the United States. That's what the Ecuadorian government has said. That if the Swedish government agrees that they'll only charge him on the sex crime charges but not hand him over to the U.S. government, then they will eject him from the embassy immediately. It's their refusal to give that guarantee that gives this fear that what this really is about is getting him to the United States so that they can then criminalize the acts of journalism he engaged in.
And so this kind of leads me then to the acts of Sweden, right, at this point, and also the UK, who have, at least the UK has stripped the citizenship of several folks of Somali descent, and we've just discovered that they've rendered them, and Sweden has been cooperative, even though they kind of, decided not to really name the level of their cooperation. And I think about 2 days ago, there was a story about an Egyptian citizen who was a British-born citizen, Mohammed Sakr, who's just been killed, right? He had his citizenship stripped, and now he's been droned.
Right, by a drone attack.
Yeah,
Right.
which kind of, I mean, first of all, the heinousness of it, and also kind of really exemplifies this kind of U.S. pressure and how effective it is on these various countries to cooperate. But I guess the other question that it leads to is, I mean, do you think that this is the kind of thing that the U.S. is going to start doing, start stripping folks of citizenship and then droning them? I mean, they haven't actually felt the need to strip them.
Yeah,
right?
exactly. I mean, the United States is perfectly happy to kill people even if they have their citizenship,
Yeah.
so there's almost no need to even go through that process. Interestingly, there's this remarkable political controversy taking place now. I find it incredibly remarkable that the nominee to lead the CIA that President Obama nominated, John Brennan, who was a Bush-era CIA official and advocated all kinds of enhanced interrogation techniques, what civilized normal people call torture, and has been at the center of so many of the policies that we've been discussing tonight, is having his nomination impeded, held up, delayed, because 3 or 4 senators, led by a Republican, Rand Paul, but joined by a couple of Democratic senators, have been asking the White House this question. This is really the question they're asking the White House. They're saying, we know that you believe that you have the power to target American citizens, not just foreign nationals, but American citizens, for execution without charges, and we know that you believe that because you've released documents justifying that power and because you've actually done it. What we want to know is, do you also believe that you have the power to target American citizens for execution by drone or any other assassination squad, any other means, without charges, in secrecy, who are on U.S. soil? Now, the fact that the United States Senate is actually asking the White House and the CIA nominee whether they believe they have that authority is a pretty compelling signal for how degraded things have become. Even more amazing is that for weeks now, the Obama White House and John Brennan have simply refused to answer that question. They've been pretending it wasn't asked. They would get asked, do you believe you have the power to target American citizens for death on U.S. soil? And they would say, the United States has never used drones on American citizens on U.S. soil. And it's like, I know, but that's actually not the question. And they've asked this repeatedly, and finally they threatened that they were going to filibuster and delay Brennan's confirmation unless they were answered. And I just saw when I was coming over here that the Obama administration gave an answer in the form of a letter from Eric Holder that wasn't really an answer, but it pretended to be an answer. And what it said was, yes, of course the president has the authority to use lethal force, including against U.S. citizens, but we would only use it in the rarest of circumstances. Like if someone's plotting like a 9/11 attack or a Pearl Harbor attack, or whatever, which is really a way of saying, yes, we have that power, but don't worry about it because you can trust us not to abuse it, which even if you're willing to place your faith in the current president not to abuse that power, I can't imagine anybody would think that way. I'm willing to trust this in one man to decide who should die without any accountability or due process. But even if you're willing to think that, once you accept the theory, that means that whoever succeeds President Obama, and there will be a common time when he leaves office, and there might even be a big bad Republican who takes over, or a Democrat, if that's the party that you dislike, you're vesting that power in that person as well. And it's amazing that that's not a huge political scandal, the idea that we're even having a discussion about whether the president has the authority to execute people. I mean, the death penalty gets debated. The death penalty, which is imposed after someone is convicted of a crime in multiple appeals, I'm vehemently opposed to the death penalty, and lots of other people are as well. But amazingly, there seems to be less of a problem with the death penalty being imposed by the president without even the pretense of charges or due process or trials.
But it's also of a piece with a point that you talked about earlier, that somehow the same Democrats who are vociferous and vocal, right, when a number of these policies were initiated under a Republican president, have really quieted down. And in some sense, it's a consistent position with the position that says, but it's my president, I trust him to use drones. We've seen this, right? You've gotten into debates about this in the last couple months.
Right.
I have too. It's like, well, we can because he's a Democrat. And it's not just the short-sightedness of it, right? I mean, at some point, presumably, Obama will not actually be granted a third term. There will be, right, some kind of turnover at some point. And so the question, is still there, right? Do we trust anybody, let alone the current president? But why is it that there's this high level of quietude?
I think
Under this administration.
I think a couple things. I mean, when I first started writing about these political issues, and I stopped practicing law in order to write about politics, it was like 2005. So it was the first year of the second term of the Bush administration. And I started writing almost immediately prior to the revelation by the New York Times that the Bush administration had been spying for years on the conversations of American citizens without getting the warrants that the criminal law required. There was a law in place. It said no government official can eavesdrop on the conversations of Americans without getting warrants. If you do that, you'll be punished with a $10,000 fine and a 5-year prison sentence for each offense. It was a pure criminal act that the Bush administration got caught engaging in. And when I started writing about it, I thought, I'm going to have a lot of conservative allies when I denounce this practice, because conservatives, as they've been saying for years and years and years, is the political faction that believes in restrained federal power, right? And they're going to be really upset that the federal government has been listening in on the conversations of American citizens without first getting a warrant from a court. And of course, they weren't upset at all. They were completely supportive. And so there came a time when I realized that the reason they were so supportive, even though it completely contradicted every single prong of the political ideology they claimed to believe in, was because they weren't viewing these issues as political principles. They were viewing it almost like a television viewer views a reality TV program. Like, reality television works because you sit in front of your TV and you decide, I really like that person and I hate that person. And once you make that decision, everything else that you think about and how you react is shaped by that personal opinion that you've reached toward that individual. And what I realized is that these conservatives, so culturally identified with George Bush, they saw him as an evangelical Christian, a down-home, sort of salt-of-the-earth, swaggering Texan cowboy, that they trusted that he could be vested with these powers and would only use them for the good. And so the tactic that I ended up using was, look, we all know that George Bush would never abuse the power to eavesdrop on American citizens. I mean, everyone knows that. But just imagine that when 2008, Hillary Clinton becomes president. Do you want her being able to listen in on your private conversations without going to a court and showing a court that you've done something wrong? And the reason that doesn't really work is because tribal identity in politics is extremely powerful. And people look toward the leader that they support as being the primary shaper of their political perspective and their political activism. And I think for lots of reasons, including President Obama's charismatic presence, the dynamic attributes that he brings, the truly historic attribute of him being the first African-American president in a country with the history of race that we have, the personal loyalty to him is even more intense, and therefore much more difficult to convince people to subordinate to issues of political principle. And the problem is that when you do that, you end up allowing all kinds of policies that are truly menacing to take hold and to become entrenched in ways that are going to be impossible to uproot once there's a leader who you feel a lot less comfortable with.
Great. Thank you. So let's open up the floor for questions. Chelsea is going to be on one side and Colby will be on another. Please wait until the mic is handed to you. Chelsea.
First of all, I want to thank you so much for your constant fearlessness in speaking truth to power. You're an inspiration to so many of us. You had said that actually we can resist, that those who do understand what's happening can overcome, but how can you really validate that, as Morris Berman wrote in his brilliant trilogy, if there were 200,000 people in the United States who really got it, who really understood it, there might be hope, but there aren't. And given all the fear inducement and the militaristic mindset and the virtual dismantlement of the Occupy movement, what can we do? How can we find hope in the realistic possibility of resisting these overwhelmingly destructive forces?
Yeah, I mean, I think that you find hope in historical example. So, in the 1960s, there were genuinely profound changes that took place with massive protests against the Vietnam War, with demands for equal rights for women, for gay Americans. Obviously, the war against Jim Crow laws and separate but equal was a multi-front war. And all of these battles enlisted a very wide cross-section of people devoted to battling injustice. And that's been the history of the United States. As long as these core rights are protected, that possibility for change always takes place. That question, well, what can we do about it? I don't have like a really clean PowerPoint 3-point, presentation that unveils the magic solution. This kind of change is always grinding and incremental and slow. but it is inexorable. And I think that it requires patience and passion. And I think that, there's all kinds of reasons to be hopeful. And you have to find within you whatever your particular talent is and how you can exploit that talent to enlist other people, to persuade other people, to devise strategy, to devote resources. It just takes people coming together in a way that is effective and that we've seen work so many times before. And I think you've seen some hints of that. I mean, when President Obama ran in 2008, the issues that we're talking about were actually at the centerpiece of his campaign. They weren't just ancillary issues. The idea of closing Guantanamo, restoring the rule of law in the United States, conducting whatever war against terrorism we had to in accordance with our value, ending torture, closing CIA black sites. These were all issues that he ran on at the center of his campaign, and it resonated. I mean, he won pretty overwhelmingly in 2008. And I think that demonstrated that public opinion wants that kind of leadership, that kind of moral leadership. And it showed that it's possible. And if it doesn't come from political leaders, then the question becomes, where does it come from? And the answer ought to be from us.
I'm over here.
Hi. My question is, what do you make of the media's role in sort of verifying the illegal actions of the United States government? And this kind of comes in the context of having recently watched Argo and Zero Dark 30.
Right. Yeah. It's funny. I spent... I think like 2 months arguing with the entire world about the evil of Zero Dark 30. And because I had watched it and I think I have like a pretty jaded and cynical view. Like, it's really hard to shock me, but I was shocked by that film because of the way in which it just so clearly presented torture, not as even morally neutral, which would have been bad enough, but as a positive and instrumental force in finding Osama bin Laden, which is what Americans cheer for more than any other single act over the last decade. Which by itself is, by the way, pretty revealing that there's not much that Americans feel this nationalistic pride over, but our ability to hunt down this like old crippled terrorist and pump bullets into his skull and then dump his corpse into the ocean is something that people chant nationalistic slogans about. That's kind of revealing in itself. But so that film was unbelievably propagandistic, not only because of how it showed torture, but also because of how every single Muslim and Arab in the film were these dark, menacing terrorists who were the perpetrators of violence, and almost every American were basically the innocent victims of violence, just going about our business, bothering nobody in the world, and then suddenly we're attacked on 9/11 for no clear reason. Why did they hate us? And then all we have to do is try and get the perpetrators, and along the way we're continuously attacked more. It was, basically nothing but an uncritical affirmation of the worldview of the CIA. And the fact that hundreds of millions of dollars were poured into this film, and that it was done in conjunction with the CIA, that was feeding the filmmakers with classified information, and that it was hailed as the greatest film by American film critics and the film critic community, and declared to be the almost certain winner of the Academy Awards. That combination was just so amazing to me that I just had to wage war against this film. And when it was pretty lonely, when very few people had seen it and everyone assumed it was great. But ironically, what had happened was I was so focused on Zero Dark 30 that I actually didn't pay any attention to Argo, which now that I've seen it is actually worse. And in fact, I was so rooting against Zero Dark 30. And I wrote this column after Zero Dark 30 got humiliated at the Academy Awards. The only thing that it won was like a half of an award for sound editing, which I was glad about. It was somehow more humiliating than if it had just won nothing. And I wrote this column saying, look, the CIA got humiliated, the film critics got humiliated because people realized this was an odious film. And everyone was kind of angry at me, and they said, yeah, but Argo won, and that's actually worse. And I went and watched it, and I said, you know what? Wow, it really is. And the reason Argo was worse was the same reason. Every single Iranian was depicted as this kind of crazed, ferocious, savage menace to all things civilized and good, which is America. And the context for all of that we had imposed this unbelievably savage, bloodthirsty, torturous regime on them for decades, and then gave sanctuary to him and prevented them from trying him, and that their anger over that was based upon the very rational understanding that we had destroyed their political culture and their country and imposed on them the rule of a monster after overthrowing their democratically elected leader, was completely erased. There was like a brief mention of it just to check it off at the box, and then it's like, all right, now let's get to what really is interesting about how we've been victimized by these Iranian monsters. And this is one of the most important factors in everything that we're discussing. Although I didn't discuss it tonight, I write a lot about media issues for that reason. The idea of why we have a free press, the whole point of it, if you go and read the theory behind it, was that we know that people are going to abuse political power, so we have to have all these institutions that are completely adversarial to it, to provide checks on it, to impose limits. And we need a free press because the free press will hate political leaders, they'll work against them, they'll expose them, they'll want to undermine them and subvert them. And the media that we have is exactly the opposite. The media has basically merged with the government so that they're in the same socioeconomic circles. They promote and affirm all government claims rather than undermine and subvert them. Obviously, the best example is the run-up to the Iraq War, when even the liberal New York Times led the way in trumpeting every single anonymous lie that they were fed as news on the front page. It really showed this kind of collaboration between the establishment media and the government in a way that really has gutted one of the most important checks that we were supposed to have on the abuse of power. And the only reason why I don't spend my days and nights pulling my hair out about this fact is because it really is true that the advent of the internet has enabled this competing force to arise that actually is democratizing political discourse and enabling people to have influence without going to work for those large corporations that own media, and that have really shamed and changed the way those media outlets function, but more importantly provided an alternative for huge numbers of people who now get their news from the internet. And I think it has, there's lots of ways that the internet, there's sort of triumphalist claims about the internet and the ways it's going to revolutionize everything that haven't really come to pass yet. But that is one way that the internet really has had an incredibly positive change. And it's the reason why, like, when people in their 20s say to me, what political issue do you think I should work on that's most compelling? I always say it's the war for internet freedom. Because ultimately, the internet, like all technologies, will either be a force to continue to subvert the power structure and to democratize discourse, or it'll be just yet another weapon, an incomparably powerful weapon, to enable people in power to control and pacify the citizenry even more if they can control the internet. And that, to me, is sort of the central front in the war of everything that we're talking about, for exactly the reason that you said, that the mindset that will be propagated if you leave it to large corporate institutions or Hollywood studios is one very much that simply amplifies government claims rather than challenges them and questions them and undermines and subverts them.
So Glenn, I'm over here. I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit to sort of the spreading economic inequality in the country, along with this development of the national security state, and what, at least to me anyways, seems like a development of our government sort of combining with the corporate sector as well. I know that's a lot of questions at once, but.
Yeah, I would say this. The best possible answer that I could give has actually already been given to that question by Martin Luther King, who in 1968 gave this incredibly profound speech in April of 1968. I think it was something like 6 weeks before he was killed, in the Riverside Church in Harlem. And what had happened was he began devoting increasing amounts of energy to opposing the Vietnam War. And there were lots of people who had been followers of his and allies of his in the civil rights movement, African Americans and others, who started to get kind of uncomfortable with how much time he was spending on anti-war activism and saying, this obsession that you have about the Vietnam War is actually distracting from the civil rights work that you're doing. And he gave this speech designed to address that criticism. And what he said was that his anti-war activism was not a distraction from civil rights work. It was a necessary prerequisite to it. And he gave 8 independent reasons why it would be impossible to battle economic inequality and violence in the United States and discrimination, racial discrimination, without first trying to end this permanent national security and war state that the United States government had embraced. First, because the huge amounts of money that go into armaments and weaponry and the maintenance of foreign armies means that the domestic population is deprived. So you can rally all you want for elevation of the welfare of Americans, but as long as the war machine is eating up the vast bulk of resources, none of that will matter. That as long as the American government is using violence and domination around the world, it's impossible to tell people domestically that they should engage in nonviolence as a means of political change. And also the fact that empire is always about inequality, because what empire is about is a very small number of people wielding immense power without challenge. And that model is what then translates into things like oligarchy and plutocracy and ensures that we don't have any relative equality in the economic realm as well. And for me, like, everything that we're talking about tonight, like indefinite detention, surveillance, the ability to kill people, all of this has been justified by reference to Muslims and Islamic radicalism and terrorism. But at this point, it actually has very little to do with that. What it has to do with instead is exactly what you just referenced, which is the US government and policy planners know, they've looked at Western European countries, incredibly stable ones, where there has been immense instability and unrest because of this growing economic inequality and this concern and knowledge that there's no economic security in the future for the vast majority of people. And they anticipate that there will be serious unrest in the United States as well. We've already saw the burgeoning movements of like the Tea Party that in the initial instance was very much about anger and contempt for the political process, and the Occupy movement as well. That was just the very beginning. And there's an anticipation that there's going to be lots more social unrest. There has to be, because economic inequality is only going to grow. And all of these powers that we're talking about that have been justified in the name of terrorism are really about enabling the people who own the government and control the government to continue to shield their prerogatives and their privilege and their power by pacifying the citizenry, which is what you do and you accomplish that by acquiring more and more power. The ability to imprison people without charging them with a crime, the ability to even target them with death, the ability to act with total secrecy, to monitor and surveil and have everything they're doing while they know nothing about what you're doing, because everything you do is behind this wall of secrecy. It creates this incredible power imbalance. It maintains the culture of fear that I described earlier that pacifies the citizenry. And ultimately, if worse comes to worse, it enables the use of force. And you did see that with the Occupy movement. The reason there's no more Occupy movement, mostly, is because the police crushed it. And the way they crushed it is by taking all the tactics that were perfected in Baghdad and the SWAT-like uniforms that they wear and the massive amounts of post 9/11 Homeland Security money that have bought tanks and really a paramilitarized unit in the United States, and use that excessive force against this relatively incipient movement as a way of signaling if a real movement comes, this is what you're going to face. And it's a way of intimidating it in the first instance, and if that doesn't work, being able to crush it with all these theories. And that's why I say the importation of the war on terror tactics to me is the most significant civil liberties issue. Not because it will any longer only persecute Muslims, it will continue to do that for sure, but also because it is now going to have general application as the primary means of preventing any real dissent, any real change in the United States. And it's all grounded in that, not concerned with that knowledge that growing income inequality will inevitably produce social unrest the way it has in every single society in every single era.
Great. There's something here from this. Behind Susanna.
Hi. I guess my question is, I was wondering if you'd ever continued your line of thought in your critique of state power to sort of the logical end of that, which is a critique of the existence of the state itself. And a follow-up question is, due to your sort of appointment with The Guardian, which is one of the great liberal elite media institutions, have you ever felt constrained from writing about that?
Okay, so I'll just answer the second question first because it's an easier one to answer, which is, my deal with The Guardian, and when I started talking about going to write for The Guardian, what I said to them in the very first conversation in the very first sentence of the very first conversation was that my absolute prerequisite to ever considering going to write for anybody anywhere, no matter what they offer, no matter what kind of visibility they could provide, no matter what they paid, is that I have complete and total editorial independence, which means that there's not a single person who can ever touch even a comma, that nobody can even correct a typo, that nothing that I write goes to an editor before it sees the light of day, that I post it directly to the internet, that nobody even makes suggestions to me about what I should write or shouldn't write about, even if they're ostensibly optional, that I'm just to be forgotten about and left alone. And so, you know, and that to me, the reason I was able to do that was because of what we were talking about earlier, which is the internet allowed me, you know, I just started a blog one day, and it was a free blog, and it enabled me to build a readership and not to have to care about any of these kinds of constraints on discourse, so that the only consideration that I had was being truthful to my readers. And it didn't matter then what orthodoxies I was challenging or who I was offending, because I didn't have those constraints, and then I was able to build a large enough readership that those institutions wanted me to come and sort of take the readership that I had, so that my deal was, you'll benefit from my being there, and otherwise just leave me alone. So no, I'm not constrained, and I never would be anywhere where I would be. As far as the first question is concerned, which is basically like, do you embrace anarchist theories or whatever, this is what I would say about that. I think if you're an academic, you know, and yes, I apologize for that derogatory term, and actually Professor Sheth is starting to become much more of a political writer in non-academic settings. So let me just point to a hypothetical professor over there, not her. If you're an academic, you sort of, one of the great things about academia is that you have the luxury of pursuing theories, and you can pursue them to the end of time, even if everyone in the world thinks you're completely crazy and insane, right? I mean, that's the benefit of tenure. It's what academic institutions are intended to foster, right? The pursuit of what you think is truth without fear of any consequence of any kind. And so if I were in academia, those are the kinds of questions I would grapple with. You know, is the ultimate conclusion to what I'm saying theoretically really that there should be a state of anarchy? You know, like Noam Chomsky has grappled with that question, being at MIT. I look at myself first and foremost as a political activist and a political writer. And so I always feel like my obligation, first and foremost, is to think about how I can have the greatest impact on political outcomes. Because I think that if I only think about how can I just kind of exist in this ethereal world of intellectualizing and kind of questioning these things without regard to the consequence, it's sort of self-indulgent, right? I mean, if I actually believe what I'm saying tonight, that there's all these massive injustices that are subjecting people to incredibly vindictive and cruel circumstances, which is what I believe, I think it'd be really irresponsible of me to start doing things that would make me less effective. And so I don't wake up in the morning and think, what should my position be about the anarchist state, or you know, the state of anarchist theory, because that's just going to, it's not going to achieve any outcome. I'm glad there are people who are doing that. I think those are important questions. They're just not ones that I want to ask, because what I want to do instead is figure out how to assemble coalitions, how to galvanize people into actual pragmatic action that will have a positive effect on these injustices. So maybe like in 30 years when I'm like, okay, I'm so sick of like political activism, I just want to sit in a classroom, you and I can have that discussion. But it's just not, those aren't just, they're just not the kinds of things that I try and grapple with publicly or as part of my writing, because I think it would just undermine what I'm trying to accomplish.
That's good. Anybody on that side? No? Okay. Up back in the back.
Yeah, so I was wondering, in your opinion, how you feel that the discourse surrounding the right to bear arms plays into this general discussion of civil liberties.
It's interesting. I'm on a speaking tour. This is part of a speaking tour that I'm doing, and I've been asked that question every single event. And it's a great question, because this is what I think is most interesting about that question. Part of the debate about gun control, like the people who advocate, who are opposed to gun control, are typically conservatives, not entirely, but typically. And one of the arguments they make, like the really frivolous ones say, I need to be super armed because I'm going to like stand up to a criminal and I'm going to protect my family and I'm going to, defend myself. And there's lots of statistics and lots of studies that prove the opposite is true, that the introduction of guns generally on average ends up increasing your risk of dying in those kind of situations rather than decreasing them. And there's all kinds of weird psychological things that drive people to think that way. But the more serious argument to me, and the more serious and interesting aspect of this debate has been that the real argument that conservatives make about why they need to be armed is because they don't want to be defenseless against the state, because in the event that the state becomes tyrannical, they want to be able to defend themselves. Now that too has its own ridiculousness to it, the idea that this massive apparatus that has been constructed, named the federal government, armed to the teeth beyond what any other nation in the world can even compete with, let alone a bunch of ragtag groups of citizens walking around with 38s, can actually stand up to that entity, is absurd. But the theoretical framework of that, which is that it's important that the citizenry be able to compete in terms of power with the states, that if the state does become tyrannical, it can't do it without resistance, is a very legitimate and real perspective. And one of the things that has kind of repelled me, to be honest, is that the side of the debate with which I most sympathize in the gun control debate, which are proponents of gun control, have taken that concern and just completely mocked and derided it, as though it's the province of only the paranoid and conspiratorial, that like these ridiculous people would actually think that that there might come a day when the United States government could be tyrannical and we would have to resist it by force. Like the idea that this is just so improbable that all you have to do is mock it and then it ends, I found really repellent. And I think one of the things that it kind of reveals is that there's this very unattractive strain in American liberal thought and American progressive thought that likes to style itself as free and independent thinkers who are kind of separate from institutional loyalty and being dictated to by institutions, but who are actually probably the most strident institutional loyalists. It's a form of authoritarianism to view institutional power as inherently legitimate and something that need not be feared and something that should always be expanded without safeguards. And I think American liberals have kind of revealed themselves as being plagued by that affliction in lots of different ways, including in the gun control debate, now that they're the ones who are sort of the dominant political faction in the United States. And I think it's something to be wary of and to sort of combat.
Okay, I see a hand over there, please.
Hi, I was wondering what your take on these emerging nations trying to emulate the US foreign policy would be. Like emerging nations like India and China are trying to, like they are in fact emulating the same foreign policy, the brutal foreign policy that US actually conducted with a lot of Latin American nations. And the irony that you actually, like the people, the civil polity, the society that actually they have to deal with is because they think of the US, at least the part of the world where I come from, they really do have this notion, false or not, that the US is, a symbol for human rights. There is this huge hegemonic view, and while the very state is actually conducting, they're actually involved in these brutal acts because they're emulating US, and at the same time this polity is looking up to the US to help it. So there's this paradox that these civil society is actually stuck at. So what would your take on that be?
So, I think the idea that the rest of the world looks up to the US as some kind of a symbol of, I don't know if you were suggesting as a symbol of human...
It's a hegemonic view, like that, the US is there, the US does stand for
that
human
it has
rights.
superior power or superior virtue?
Well, there is the state that's trying to emulate the foreign policy, but then there's civil society that's that's hoping that the U.S. does stand for human rights. So there's this ironical
so
view.
I think that the idea of viewing the U.S. as a paragon of human rights or as the leader of human rights is
wrong.
Something, well, clearly wrong, but undebatably wrong. But it's something that isn't nearly as pervasive as it was even 3 or 4 decades ago. And I mean, if you go around the world, you see that anecdotally. If you look at polling data, you see that with confirmation. In the Muslim world, as a matter of fact, the U.S. is viewed more negatively now under President Obama, even than it was under President Bush. Mildly worse, but actually worse. And the other point that you've raised is one that I think is really significant, which is, for a long time, if you are the most powerful force in the world, you can act in ways that you can sort of violate the golden rule, right? Like the idea that you should only do unto others what you would want them to do unto you is one that you can completely ignore if you have the greatest power, because what you do unto others, they cannot do unto you. And so it doesn't matter whether you want them to do the things to you that you're doing to them, they can't. And so you can ignore that. There comes a time though, when, because you weaken or they become stronger, that they can actually start to do unto you what you're doing unto them. And then your disregard for that rule starts to reap all sorts of negative consequences. And this, I think, is what we're really seeing more than anything else. If the United States goes around the world killing whoever it wants by flying unmanned robots over the territory of other countries, those countries are eventually going to start doing that to other countries, probably including the United States as well. Amazingly, the United States just released this report that talked about how other nations, including Iran and China, are posing this grave threat that the United States calls cyber terrorism, and announced that they were going to quadruple the number of people in the Pentagon working on cyber terrorism, cyber warfare. The reality is that the United States and Israel are the only countries ever to actually use cyber warfare against other countries, in particular against Iran, when it released this incredibly sophisticated virus into Iran's nuclear enrichment facilities that escaped onto the internet and is still causing damage to this day. And the idea that the United States is doing exactly the sort of things that it accuses other countries of doing isn't really known inside the United States because our media doesn't report it, but it is known everywhere else. To me, the most amazing event of the last 12 years was after the United States got attacked on 9/11. The question that got asked was, the famous, sort of notorious, embarrassing, humiliating, pitiful, why did they hate us? And it was all grounded in that belief that Americans quite understandably had, that we don't actually go around harming anybody else. And so it's unfathomable why anybody would want to attack us. And that was really a question that Americans had, and the government needed to provide an answer for that. And the answer they provided was, well, they hate us for our freedoms. These are, radicals. They don't like the fact that we have women on television who are uncovered. They hate the fact that we democratically elect all of that. When, of course, all you had to do to know the answer to that question was to listen to what people in that part of the world had been saying for decades. We actually hate you not because of your freedoms, but because you keep arming our dictators and pouring arms into Israel and letting them kill our civilians and putting bases on our soil and enabling all sorts of violence in our part of the world and other interference in our part of the world. And so I think what you're going to see more and more of is that the kind of violence that we keep bringing to other countries, as we get weaker militarily and economically, and other countries get stronger, certainly like India and China, and there are lots of other countries as well, that we're going to start becoming the target of those attacks, and the American citizenry will be really bewildered, like, why would anybody want to do this to us? But our ability to impose international constraints on them will be severely hampered, because although the American population won't know it, the rest of the world will know that the only reason why we'll be calling for constraints is because now we're not the perpetrators of that, but the victims of it. And I think, this resentment has built up over the decades. It's like when the neighborhood playground bully finally gets beaten up, there's this outpouring of kind of glee and happiness and a desire to exact vengeance. That resentment has been bubbling up for decades in all parts of the world, and I think it's ready to spill over. And the more we kind of pursue these policies of aggression and militarism and domination in the rest of the world, the worse I think that blowback is going to be.
I think we have time for one more question. Back there. Could you wait for the mic, please?
Yes.
Thank you.
Glenn, Eduardo Suarez, and I'm originally from Panama, and from 87 on, we were against the Noriega dictatorship, but we were also concerned about what became the invasion of Panama. So what happened during the invasion was the utilization of the stealth bomber and the whole incendiary bombs and things like that. So when I talk to folks, I talk to them that what's happening right now in Iraq, Afghanistan, Yemen, and places like that, and what you talk about the drones, I'm concerned about the utilization of those weapons against citizens in this country and many other places. So every time that the Pentagon utilizes its weapons, it's not against other people in an imaginary place, but actually it's against us, all of us. And I just want you to talk more about that correlationship of the utilization of weapons in these places and the prolongation of a permanent war.
Right. It's a great point, and I'm glad we're ending on it. Because, well, let me say one thing about the Noriega dictatorship, which is, although the United States ended up declaring that Noriega was this grave threat to regional stability, of course, Noriega for a long time had been a very close friend and ally of the CIA, which is pretty much true of every single enemy that we ever go to war with, including the wars that we're fighting now. And you know, it's one of the major problems about the constant U.S. intervention in these parts of the world is that we end up arming our current allies who 5 years from now are going to be our new enemies. And it sort of continuously feeds this war machine and ensures that there's never any end to it. It's an incredibly brilliant design to constantly perpetuate warfare by always arming our enemies, by declaring them our allies for a short period of time. But the point that you make, I mean, ultimately is the key one, which is, if you go and sit in front of some cable news network, which I know is an incredibly unfair thing to suggest that you do, it's painful and horrifying, but if you go do it with this question in mind, like just go sit in front of, like, if you want to just waste a week of your life and have your brain atrophy, like go and sit in front of MSNBC for like a week, or or CNN, or even, which is almost as bad if not worse, and watch how often it is talked about in any kind of meaningful way how many people the United States is killing in the rest of the world. See if there's ever any discussion of the people who have died, the civilians whose lives we've ended, the number of people we've killed, the number of people we continue to kill, the impact that it has on their family members, on their communities, on their nations, on that region. It's basically completely suppressed. It just doesn't get discussed. If war costs are discussed, it's in terms of how many U.S. troops have died, but virtually no discussion at all of the impact that it has on those countries. And the reason for that is that no population, except the most sociopathic ones, would be willing to support wars over the course of as long as we've been fighting them if they were constantly confronted with the savagery of those wars and the way in which innocent life is being continuously extinguished in our names. Just 3 days ago, a U.S. helicopter in Afghanistan shot and killed two brothers, Afghan brothers, aged 10 and 11, who were walking behind their donkeys. This is a constant occurrence. And what you have is this amazing imbalance. So in the United States, we never hear about it. But of course, in Afghanistan and in Pakistan and in Yemen and in Somalia and in Iraq and in Iran and in every part of that part of the world, and then in Central America with their knowledge of the history of what we did in that region of the world, it's talked about continuously. And so we like to think that one of the reasons why we have such a different view of the world than people in other places is because they're propagandized, unlike us who have a free press. Oftentimes, in fact, most of the time, the exact opposite is true. It is we who are propagandized by these facts being concealed from us, whereas everybody else in the world is completely aware of them. And I just want to end with this one example because it's an amazing example. There was this case in Iran in 2009 where an Iranian-American journalist named Roxana Sabari was imprisoned for 2 months by the Iranian government. She was charged with a crime, given a trial, and eventually released on appeal. This was a major cause célèbre in the United States. Everybody probably knows her name. She instantly became a household word because the American media went insane covering it from start to finish. Look at the Iranian government. They imprisoned journalists. Meanwhile, the U.S. government, for 8 years, imprisoned an Al Jazeera journalist named Sami al-Haq, who they detained in Afghanistan in late 2001, and put him in a cage for 8 years without charging him with a crime. A pure photojournalist. They spent most of their time questioning him not about al-Qaeda, but about the operations of Al Jazeera, which the U.S. government viewed as essentially an enemy media organization. Sami al-Haq is a household name in the Muslim world. Everyone in the Muslim world knows that the U.S. imprisoned lots and lots of journalists in the war on terror without charges of any kind. Americans believe that that doesn't happen in the United States, that that's not something the U.S. government does, that that's something only North Korea does, as when Al Gore went and rescued flamboyantly those 2 Korean-American journalists, or what Iran does. And this kind of propaganda is very real. And it's very pernicious, and it really does shape so much of what we're talking about tonight. And the refusal of the American media to talk about the impact of our militarism and our aggression is probably the most shameful bit of malfeasance that the American media does, and is a huge factor in why all of this continues.
So, thank you.
Thank you.